Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam.
Well, hello.
And we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
We launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today's topic is context to appreciate. So, Ryan, what's the context of today's episode?
So I kind of see this as a reboot of the very first podcast episode we ever did called Conditions for Specialty Matcha Preference Acquisition, which was an opinion piece. And this one actually has a actual blog post associated with it, which is nice because it kind of pre-structured our idea before that recording, something we've since dropped.
Maybe we should pick that up again.
Yeah, we should. We should. On a weekly cadence, it's a bit difficult, but
Yeah, some special episodes maybe worth a shot.
absolutely. But the core of the argument was, how do you get someone from who is a beginner to a category, let's say matcha latte drinker or someone who likes matcha Kit Kat? How do they move? How does their consumer journey look as they move from consuming matcha as an ingredient to having something like an Americano, so just having matcha on its own with only water, to something like an usacha or a koicha? And like, what does that ladder look like? And you see these ladders exist in other industries. So you have things like beer. Like, how does someone in the middle of, I'm just going to pick a random place, Ohio, get from drinking Budweiser his entire life to wanting to try an IPA or a stout or a Saison beer? And at our last company, when we were working at the intersection of AI, sensory science, or the science of taste, and product development, we did a lot of work with brands and understanding what that consumer journey looks like for people and how people's preferences literally change as they move throughout that journey, throughout that ladder. And it's a really important discussion in the context of specialty matcha, because the way matcha is being enjoyed is very different, very fundamentally different now than it was 100 years ago. And that's going to continue to evolve. And understanding that trajectory, I think, is super important. So I thought this was worth looking at.
Absolutely. I mean, you can kind of see a lot of similarities between matcha and the current matcha movement with a lot of the other specialty movement in other beverage or food categories. And one thing that's certainly I would say, a fundamental foundation or a cornerstone of such consumer ladder is, first you need to have availability to more people so that they can actually experience the whole thing, or the diversity of the selections. And then you need some kind of a gateway product to kind of lure people into the house and then, keep them there. Usually something very like brainlessly delicious. And that's usually the gateway.
Yeah, you need something that creates that curiosity gap. And basically, every person that I know that is a tea person had some moment at some point in their history where their mind like literally expanded. And I'd say over half of the people that we've invited as guests on this podcast talk about these moments. For some people, it was a sencha. For me, it was actually a genmai cha, and that got me into tea and led me down the specialty matcha rabbit hole. Eventually, it took actually about another decade between my first sip of genmai cha to having a really deeper passion for matcha. But like, all of those have to be seeded somewhere. So I totally agree. If we back out a little bit and talk about context to appreciate, what is like the lowest level form of getting someone to appreciate something? Like, what is some common language or vocabulary that we see that anyone can understand that something is good or that something is bad?
Good question. Without tasting it first, or trying it first, or after?
Yeah, just like I'm giving you a gift, right? And I'm giving you a gift,
I see.
and I'm trying to put context around it to get you to appreciate it. Which actually in matcha is a really good example. Most people who are gifting matcha to people who have never had it for the first time, they need some sort of primer. So what's like the most basic low-level primer that anyone would understand?
It's not just for matcha, but really for other things too. It's expensive, right? It's It comes with a pretty hefty price tag, and it's rare. Rarity is often a trace or a indicator of quality, and it tastes good or it tastes interesting, and you should try it. I like it. I hope you like it too. That's usually the set of primer that you do a ordinary gift giving.
And what's funny is if you look at the least sophisticated matcha companies' marketing, that's exactly the type of framing that they use to get someone
Uh,
to appreciate something,
yeah,
right? It's rare or it's
yeah.
expensive compared to
It's
other types of
it's
tea.
and the Iamoto of something something Sankei liked it or endorsed it.
But
Very
it's really
unsophisticated.
very unsophisticated. And yeah, so that's like I would say like the absolute lowest level of context to appreciate. Everyone in the entire world, unless you're like in some nomadic rural tribe that has no interaction with modern society, understands price. And just about everyone, even the nomadic tribes people who don't use money, understand rarity for sure. And so these are like pretty universal, basic human things that we care about, and it's really the lowest level that you can use to communicate it. And you see different flavors of this. I mean, you have some people arguing, saying, matcha is like I think 6% of the tea produced in Japan, and of that, good matcha is less than 1%. And they just do this percentage of a percentage of a percentage thing, like inexperienced entrepreneurs do, saying, oh, if we can only get 1%, of the coffee industry or of the tea industry, we could be $100 million company, right? Like it's the same thing, but it's still like there's still like that one that's really hard, and you're still creating a whole lot of product to get
Mm.
there. And I find it very similar. And actually, in a lot of cases where I've been sold to that way, I find it a little bit as an insult to my intelligence as a consumer. It's like, okay, yes, it's rare, but okay, tell me more. Like, it's typically only done by people who have a very shallow understanding of matcha or the topic, whatever that is.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. I mean, like I think a lot of the things that you value in terms of rarity is not essentially rarity, right? Yeah, you can go harvest some, very, very, very rare, like Himalayan salt from the Mount Everest mountain ridge, and it's probably still going to taste like salt. It's salty by the end of the day, maybe with a little bit of the flavor difference. But what you are actually, valuing or paying for is the effort, the time that someone else spent their life or even risking their life to make it happen, to have that delivered to you. I think that actually that value system really applies to most of the things that people value nowadays, not just, specialty food or beverage, but also like art or anything that you want to spend more money to pay for. And it's really you're buying someone else's life. You're buying someone else's effort to make this thing happen. And then you can preserve it, or you can consume it, or you can enjoy it, or you can brag about it. I think that's the value chain that we are seeing here for most of the products.
Yeah, and I think, but then Zongjun, how do you distinguish between, let's say you have two artists, both of them spent 10,000 hours doing oil painting. One might be quite literally worthless, and another piece might be worth $10 million. So how do you start making quality and price distinctions within that same of, let's say, difficulty to produce? Some artificial scarcity because there's only one person that makes it, or only a handful of people that make it. Like, then how do you distinguish between products? And how is
Yeah,
value assigned?
art will be a little bit trickier because there's the cost of making that art itself, which frequently is not that much. Sometimes you can end up using some more expensive material. That, is, I would say, a little bit more arbitrary. You essentially having the artist or the gallery evaluating the worth and, make up a number. And then frequently in the art world is that, you have a series of a set or a group of galleries working together with the artists to kind of, you know, sell each other the artwork and to validate the price. kind of the dirty secret of the art industry. But it doesn't necessarily apply to specialty product a little bit. You have the seller giving a price tag, and then you have the buyer actually buying the product, which is not just a behavior of purchase, but essentially a validation of the value. And you see that in, in the world of matcha, you see that in the world of Chinese tea too, like all these outrageously expensive the Wu rock tea, and you have actual buyers buying them as a validation of the price tag that they give out. But if you take account into the cost of making those teas, it's probably not that much. But then you also need to take account into the cost of spreading the awareness, the cost of building this whole marketing strategy or this whole scheme, and also the effort of people creating all of these, and also the effort of people maintaining the status and the image of a product being so special that when the buyer and the buying the product, people won't necessarily view them as idiots, but they can actually coin the status label to them as a consummation because of all these people marketing the product behind the scene, telling other people that this product is actually very valuable.
Would you say that that can be characterized as the context to appreciate?
Yeah, I totally think that's part of the context. You're creating context, you're creating a culture, you're creating a story.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, Zongjun, there's an old saying that's frequently attributed to a French philosopher slash like sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu. I've actually never been able to dig up where exactly he wrote this, but there's a saying that the arts of the bourgeoisie will remain with the bourgeoisie because they have the formative experiences by which to appreciate them. Can we unpack that quote a little bit and then talk about how it is relevant to the discussion of giving someone the context to appreciate something?
Well, if you view that in plain language, it's basically saying that, the certain appreciation will remain within a community or social circle because they had the experience of it in the past, which crystallized into a preference, and they only them can have the experience. Because it's either expensive or either it's gated by a set of social rules. I would say it's still true for some products nowadays, especially those, for example, in the world of matcha. There are just some matcha that just not purchasable. You have to know the guy that knows the guy, or you have to be within a certain social circle, a teaching circle of a Iamoto, or a farmer's circle to be able to have the product, to have the option to buy the product. Or if you be a little bit even more outrageous, like in the world of wine, you have Romani Conti. You actually need to buy a lot of wine from the estate, from the chateau, enough to be put on a wait list to buy their, best wine on the shelf. That's some serious formative experience that, it's not just money can buy. You really need to be within a circle to have that experience.
Yeah. Well, even if you can afford that experience, right? You need certain like formative experience or like life experience to appreciate something and then to then value it. So let's put
Yeah.
this within the context of like Asian food products. Sea cucumber. I didn't grow up with sea cucumber. I don't care about sea cucumber. A sea cucumber costs like 100 US dollars. I do not have the formative experience by which to appreciate sea cucumber. I don't even really like sea cucumber. I've had it like twice, right?
I'll fix
And
that next time you're here.
but I mean, you can say the same thing about anything from high-end wine to crazy coffee to like even like leather goods, right? I don't know anything about leather
Yeah.
goods. I don't care about it. I don't value it. I don't have the formative experience to tell apart, a Birkin from a random, cheap knockoff, right? Like it's just not something that I can totally grok or understand and therefore value. Right. So sometimes it's gatekept, but oftentimes it's just like the default. So what's interesting within the context and the sphere of matcha is actually this quote is incredibly relevant to matcha 100 years ago or 150 years ago.
Oh yeah,
Right?
totally agree.
The context to appreciate matcha at the highest levels, right? If we're talking about the consumer ladder of getting the better and better experience, the better and better product. It was literally gate kept, and it actually still is. If we think about the highest ends of, let's say, cuisine, right, moving from a one to a two to a three Michelin star restaurant to, the absolute pinnacles of dining. The equivalent of that in matcha is progressing through the ranks of these tea ceremony schools. And you will absolutely reach a ceiling over time as a foreigner or if you're a woman. And something that I think it was James Freeman said, the founder of Blue Bottle, is he very quickly realized the experience of drinking coffee, or drinking coffee, is so much more than consuming a liquid, right? It's about the ambiance, it's about the space that's created, it's about the feeling that hospitality can create. And if we look at tea ceremony being like one of the fundamental examples of intentionality and hospitality, and creating the set and setting, the environment to enjoy something, in this case being matcha, right? As you progress through these levels, you get more and more and more and more context to appreciate. And there'll probably be a ceiling you'll reach as a foreigner. There's a ceiling you reach as a woman. And you have to go all the way to the tip top to get to these secret teachings, which only, basically old Japanese men and or their young heirs have access to. It is like the equivalent of the arts of the bourgeoisie, will remain with the bourgeoisie because they have the formative experiences by which to appreciate them. Some of those advanced practitioners in China, you don't even have the formative experience or the context to appreciate what's going on because it's secret teachings. It's kind of the king in the high castle level of getting the context to appreciate something in matcha. And I actually can't think of that many equivalents in food and beverage where this is still so old world. It doesn't really exist in wine. If you have enough money and time and cultural connections, you can get the best of the best of the best wine experiences. And the same thing for food or for coffee. But matcha is actually really unique that it's still trapped in this old world system.
Yeah, Ryan. But there's also a very interesting, I would say, the assessment to how or what exactly are they appreciating by the end of the ladder. In this case,
Mm.
the secret teaching in Channel You. It's what exactly are they appreciating versus what do matcha drinker cares? I think there has to be a discrepancy. They are not maybe not necessarily looking at the same thing. I'm not at a discrediting the value or the context of both sides, but there's definitely a discrepancy. And to many extents, I go back to my previous argument is that the context to appreciate or the context the sheer construction of a context is essentially you're building a culture. The context to appreciate something by the end of the day is within that culture vocabulary or culture knowledge that something is better than something else. And the comparison, the factors or the criteria of comparison might be a little bit different when you compare two cultures. In this case, we are comparing, Channel U versus, specialty matcha. And,
I so totally agree. And I think that
they might
is like
not be.
why
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think that's why we're at the cusp of the specialty matcha revolution. We're building up this culture that's appreciating it on an entirely different, what I'll call pleasure vectors or culturally enriching vectors, cultivar, terroir, farmers, production techniques, right? The
Yes.
Iamotos aren't sitting around and the Chanyu people aren't sitting around talking about how incredible this 44-day Hanzu shaded Asahi is. Like who
Mm.
knows what they're talking about, but that certainly we're appreciating things from a very, very different perspective. But this one can be democratized. The arts of the bourgeoisie don't have to remain with the bourgeoisie here, right? Anyone with an internet connection and a little bit of disposable income can get access to these references and enjoy it, and have a ladder to climb as they get deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. It's a
Yep,
people's
yep,
movement.
yep. It's from bottom to top, not from top to bottom, which is a very different route. But it's no longer being confined by a certain authority. It's easier for everyone to participate. But also for this to really happen in a larger scale, you really need to have the availability of different diversities of criterias.
And you need to have new companies giving people new sets of things to appreciate, right? Which is what all of these specialty principles are, around cultivar, terroir, all the interesting stories and farmers and techniques that people are talking about that can lead to very different flavor profile outcomes, right? It gives people a rabbit hole to go down. And we're at the really exciting early stages of that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Ultimately comes down to the topic that we talked about in a previous podcast. What do you care about? What are your stack rank priorities, right? And in a specialty subculture within matcha, it's about the flavor, it's about the people, it's about the farmer, right? It's not necessarily about the poetic name or how it relates to the theme or how that relates to the season. Those are all very beautiful and wonderful things. But the context to appreciate all of that is living in an extremely different sphere than something like specialty matcha is. And actually, I think that's where we see a lot of this painful, what I'll call it, judgment on the internet between people who care about very different things. And that essentially, like, people are experiencing matcha on two entirely different pleasure vectors, different things out of this same product. And like the tea ceremony people screaming at people for using quote unquote ceremonial grade matcha in their matcha latte should have a taste of their own medicine. I think that they should taste a culinary grade in a latte and then taste a ceremonial grade latte and tell me honestly which one tastes better. Like, I agree, you cover up some subtlety and nuance, but the person who's enjoying taking a higher quality product and mixing it with milk, which is not me, by the way, but you cannot deny that it tastes better. And that person couldn't care less that it would make the perfect usacha and the perfect temai after preparing it on a tatame mat. Like, it just doesn't matter to them, right? They want a good tasting beverage, right? And they are forming an appreciation that is so different than that other person.
Yeah, but this judgment is not unique to matcha, though. I'm just thinking out loud, but you see this in all the other specialty beverages. I think ultimately it's a judgment between something that it's in its quote unquote pure form versus inclusions. Like you see this in the world of coffee, right? Like latte is just being judged as inferior than black coffee by all aspects. The specialty coffee people wouldn't necessarily brag about, they make the best latte, best tasting latte using this very expensive special bean. Also, you see this in the world of wine, right? Like you have all these fortified wine, which are actually very delicious. I'm a big fan of sherry. But how you end up making sherry is that you add brandy or extra alcohol into a fermenting wine to stop the fermentation and to keep a lot of residual sugar and adding some other flavors into the beverage, so that it's also no longer pure, which also views as inferior than ordinary wine. So all these fortified wine, they can be very delicious and aged for a long time, but the price of them is still much lower than other well aged vintage Barolo, for example.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's because that's where the specialty market exists within wine. People have a context to appreciate the other thing more.
Yeah, yeah, but my argument is that, this idea of adding something else into a product and getting judged as inferior exists in other, products, not just, matcha, but also in coffee, also in wine, which is very interesting.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's definitely not something that's unique to matcha.
Yeah, but they can taste very delicious. I wonder why this is such a stigma in other, because like sometimes they're not really like pure, right? Like you have all these sort of co-fermentation in coffee, right? Like you add like fruit or some other things and spice and ferment with the coffee together to get a new product. You also have all these barrel aging practice in the world of whiskey, right? Like you essentially adding other flavors into the whiskey, into the liquid, by putting them into a barrel that have stored other things. So the matrix or the judgment criteria of something, whether something or not it's pure, is also very interesting.
It's interesting that you say that because I bet there's a parallel universe where that purity matters less. And
Yeah.
something that I've experienced being obsessed with tea for a very long time is when you're obsessed with tea and ceramics in a Chinese context, you go back far enough, there's a lot of vessels, cups, and things like that that had some potential crossover usage where an emperor would be using something. It potentially could have been for tea, or it could have been within the context of wine, or what they would call what gets translated as wine. But then there's always another subcontext there is that the wine that they were drinking in ancient China wasn't wine at all. It was some mix of stuff, like it was some kind of rice alcohol mixed with all this herbs and other stuff. And, that was probably considered the top of the top. Wasn't a pure product at all.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well,
probably time and space have dictated that.
or even tea drinking, like back in Tang Dynasty, they also, drink these powder tea. It's really the proto matcha or proto matcha. They add all sorts of things into the pot, like tea, ginger, spice, mint, all kinds of things, and it's essentially a soup by the end of the day. And then it's only to be consumed amongst the nobles and the monarchs, which is not pure at all.
Yeah. Interesting. I wonder why that is on a broader context, why there's such a focus on purity now.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Something transitioned in history simultaneously across different cultures that people start moving from, mixing or mixture into a more pure form.
Well, I mean, I think that's also what the specialty matcha movement is largely about too. Like you cannot taste the difference between
Mm.
cultivars as easily, right? When it's mixed with milk and sugar and other things. So actually, like if you look at it from the specialty principles of like specialty matcha, bean to bar chocolate, like bean to bar chocolate, it's in the name, right? You go from beans to a bar, and the implication is that you probably aren't adding like emulsifiers, milk powder, like all the other things you can do to make what a lot of people think of as chocolate, to get a more pure expression of the agriculture and the nature and nurture steps that were used to create it. Doesn't mean that you can't produce delicious things, but it does unlock a whole new set of enriching experiences and hedonic pleasure by the fact that people can draw distinctions based on flavor, based on those attributes of the product, the cultivar, the region, the producer, the processing, etc. Fundamentally different context to appreciate, other than just like the pure sensory experience and blind hedonic pleasure of enjoying some combination of flavors.
Makes sense. And also having a product remained as having less ingredient, you are essentially getting closer to the terroir. You are getting closer to the farming technique, the local geography, the climate. Those impact will be more obvious with that recipe versus adding other things. You kind of mask all of these nuances.
So, Zongjun, for any of the matcha brand owners listening, what are some things that we can do as an industry, in your opinion, that will make quote unquote smarter consumers? Like, if we have a lot of different consumer interaction, and like some people will be like, oh, okay, yeah, they're kind of basic. They're just talking about how much is healthy and rare. Or you can have a really enriching conversation where you immediately realize, wow, this person's got a lot of context. How do we create more of those people that are quote unquote smart consumers or good buyers, where they're able to differentiate between products and then assign value because they're aware of the market rates for similar products that have been objectively labeled that way. And I'll just use Suji-san as an example. And we like to use him as he's a really good example because he has so much representation by other Western vendors. You start doing some price comparison across websites, and you realize that there's actually a ridiculously large range which Suji-san's products sell for, but it's the same product, right? Right. That's what a smart consumer would do. They'll start connecting the dots. Like this person didn't mention Suji-san, but everything is grown in Shirakawa. which is like Suji-san's basically the only well-known producer in Shirakawa, and these happen to be all the same cultivars, Asahi, Uji Hikari, Samidori, Sayamidori, whatever, that he grows. And this is almost certainly from Suji-san. Like that's what smart buyers are doing right now with his products, and like they're price triaging. Johnny Matcha is selling it for an insanely cheap price. And then if you go over to Kettle, it's like literally double. I was just checking this yesterday for what is basically the same product.
Uh,
How do we get more of these smart? And in that case, they're both
yeah.
labeled as Suji-san. But let's say they're not labeled as Suji-san, right? Like, how do we help? How do people have the context needed to do this type of detective work?
This really goes back to the quote from Pierre Bourdieu is that you need to have formative experience. You need to actually know what those products are and what do they taste like to be able to make a rational judgment or assessment of the situation, basically, as we're talking about that this right here. And one thing that I think a lot of the vendors and our friends in the industry can really start doing is just to have the availability of different options for people to start trying. It's kind of hard right now, given this whole matcha shortage problem. But if you really want a smart, educated, informed consumer in matcha, in the world of matcha, uh, words are not enough. You really need to have them try all these stuff that they will start to have a more coherent and formative experience, and to build up a context for them to inform themselves and also inform their purchasing decisions.
Yeah, that you can't get past primary sensory experience because that's ultimately what you come to value, right?
Yeah.
Like all of this is fine and interesting theoretically and it's like intellectually interesting, but until you make that tangible link, it's just all fluff in the air.
Yeah.
That's what makes tea special. It's such a tangible thing that you can taste at the end of the day.
Yep. Yep.
So one of the things that really frustrates me, just as a consumer, and I'm just talking about my consumer experience now, is that we keep hearing from everyone, chashis, 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 they're incredible. They have such incredible skill and they're underrepresented and under talked about in the industry. They're a blind part of the industry, but they really are the backbone of keeping these products consistent. Chashis are blenders or tea purveyors. So if you go to like Maruku Koyameyan, right? They have all of these different products. Let's use Tenju as an example, right? It's somebody's job to make sure that tastes the same every year. Same thing with their Hatsu Mukashi or whatever poetic name products that they have, these different blends. And what I get so frustrated at is, okay, yeah, that's great. Chashis keep these tasting the same. Personally, I'm not even sure how consistent the flavor profiles are because I'm not buying them every year. And even so, if they taste different, I'm probably going to blame that maybe one was fresher than the other, or maybe something's wrong with my palate, or my memory is flawed after waiting 1 year to tell what the difference is. Like, but and so that's like one point. But the second point, no one knows anything about them. How in the world, as a consumer, am I supposed to appreciate what the chashis are doing when I don't know how they work? I don't know why it's hard. I have some idea based on other specialty products, but no one's talking about the actual skill. It's completely hidden without the context to appreciate. The only vector in which I can appreciate it is through my primary experience tasting these products year after year and hoping that they're consistent and observing it and then just appreciating that fact that it does happen to be consistent tasting year after year after year, right? That's the only vector that you can use to appreciate the work that these people are doing. But the skill and the craft and the intention of why does this flavor profile exist? What are you trying to do? How is it supposed to be used other than usecha or koicha, right? That's great. All of these chashis have what? I don't know. Let's say 30 different blends that are meant for usecha. Why do they exist? What is the intention behind this one versus this one versus this one? And you very rarely get that. And
Yeah.
it's a complaint that I have in this industry. Like everyone says they're so incredibly skilled, but like let's give people the context to understand that craft, that art.
Yeah, it's very interesting that they're so, mysterious. 'Cause, I mean, they're essentially formulators, right? Like, or, flavorists in all these flavor houses, or, star flavorists that make all these, fine fragrance. They are, quite, there's a very good community of and culture of appreciating their work that exists, in other industries, other, formulators in the wine industry, blenders in the whiskey industry, these start flavorists in fragrance industries. They are basically doing the same thing, but the same thing in terms of the spirit of it. But it's so interesting that the chashis are so like hidden in the world of matcha versus all these other formulators in other industries are basically celebrities.
Yeah. In the case of the flavor industry, they are a little bit behind the scenes, but that's because they're suppliers of suppliers. So, for those of you who don't know, there's this gigantic industry called the flavor industry, called flavor houses. And it's largely controlled by four very large companies: IFF, Givaudan, Simrise,
And
and
Firmenich.
Firmenich. And they have something called flavorists. And the idea is that a strawberry is not a strawberry is not a strawberry. You have various different expressions ranging from sour to ripe to green to jammy to cooked. There's all these different expressions. And it's someone's job to basically take a bunch of chemical ingredients, mix them together to create these various flavored products that they put into everything in food and beverage products. And in some cases, depending on the laws of the country, they don't even need to be labeled, right? So they can literally hide under ingredients in a label. So, for
Mm.
example, if a yogurt already has something labeled as strawberry, sometimes if the chemicals that make up the additional strawberry flavor that go inside it can hide under that label because they're chemicals that are naturally found in strawberry, for example. And those laws, those labeling laws differ across different countries, for example. But anyway, it's someone's job to make sure to come up with those various flavor expressions and to keep it consistent over time. And that is very much seen as protected intellectual property because you cannot patent a food recipe. I think it's considered a trade secret. And the other interesting, really interesting thing is one, the formulation for those different flavors are kept incredibly secret by the flavor houses. And in fact, they're so secret that the companies that buy them, all the big food and beverage companies, they don't actually know what's in that flavor because it's a trade secret by the flavor house. And then what they end up doing is they end up blending multiple flavors for multiple flavor houses to create a proprietary recipe so that the flavor houses don't even know what's in the final product. So it's a blend of a blend. And it's very
So double
important
blind.
for IP protection in the food and beverage industry. And what's going on in matcha is not quite like that. Like, I don't know, you're working with just a handful of cultivars, and like, yes, there's some seasonal variation, etc., etc. But for the most part, these are not suppliers of suppliers, right? They're the final brand owners. And why it's kept so secret, it's just a bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah. Well, I wish I can learn more about them, but it's so hard to get in touch with anyone within that community.
But it's such a more pure thing, right? When you're adding flavors to food, it's not that interesting. Does the average strawberry yogurt consumer care? Like all of the complexities that went into driving that what's going on in that flavor. But in the world of matcha or specialty matcha, like there's a lot of probably so many interesting stories to be told around how and why these various blended products exist and the art that's going on by that blender to keep them that way.
Yeah, totally agree. And there's probably a lot of history behind it too. Like, how did they exist in the first place? And, how did this culture of secret teaching end up forming? I think that will be something very interesting to discover.
Even more context to appreciate something.
Yeah, yeah.
And they don't even need to like spill all the beans, so to speak, right? They could like just hint at it, right? It might actually generate more hype if they're a little vague in their stories. I'm surprised that they're not doing this. because it could be some really powerful marketing to get people to appreciate these products more. I mean, the complaint is, right, is that like all of these quote unquote matcha girlies on TikTok are buying up all these quote unquote expensive, and they're not that expensive, cans of Marukyu Koyameyan, Yamamasa Koyameyan, like all of these like old school blend houses, and mixing them with milk. They couldn't get the context to appreciate those products if they tried. I don't have the context to appreciate those products beyond sheerly enjoying the taste. You can't get anything from them. And the Chanayu people who are complaining that they don't have them for tea ceremony, they're not sitting around enjoying them across those vectors either. They're enjoying it within this broader set and setting that is Chanayu, right? That has doesn't really have that much to do with the product other than the arbitrary poetic name that that product was given.
Yeah. From a different angle, you can also view it in a very Zen way. Like, are these contexts by the end of the day just distraction of you really just enjoy the sheer, enjoyment of that tea? It's also a different aspect, I would say. You kind of see that in appreciating art or artists creating art, or even in some other, tea branding too. You have Y2T, specializing in Chinese tea, and they are intentionally hiding all of the information about the tea, but just present you the tea itself. Want you to enjoy it, and they are delicious, and you end up focusing on the taste rather than the other information.
The reality is, though, is that can only exist in a high trust environment. That's number one. But the other problem, number two, is that people have different preferences. And so this
Mm.
might work in like the poor, crazy people who
Or
have very convergent preferences, but where they're divergent preferences, especially on a global stage. Right? We're talking about consumers as diverse as Thailand or Saudi Arabia or Mexico. Like people's might have very different preferences, and without clearly labeled objective attributes, they are not able to draw a straight line between what they're tasting, what they like, and where to
yeah,
find that.
yeah, I agree, and they are also facing a much more mature consumer community, with which a lot of them already have the formative experience of all these kind of teas, and they can make their own judgments or assessment of the product. I do agree, and this is what the matcha specialty matcha movement is lacking right now. Is that availability of having more people have the formative experience of such,
Yeah.
which
There is no
it's actually
universal beauty. There is no universal beauty in matcha. It's you know, we all might converge on very different things that we like.
yeah, yeah. And this really doesn't contradict the traditional way of presenting matcha. All these traditional houses can still have their product, sitting in a very mysterious box with a poetic name. And it might be actually more fun for more people having the formative experience, having the context to appreciate matcha, to revisit all these traditional products, and they might learn something new, or they might discover something new. In the past it was just a mysterious can of deliciousness. Now I can actually taste the asahi, or I can taste the honzu in the can.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Going back and forth is a really interesting exercise. And to like bring on new lenses, new perspectives, new context to appreciate what was once a mystery, but can be less of a mystery because we have some ground truth references and appreciate it through a specialty lens and then go back the other direction. I totally agree. And as you accumulate more and more tasting experiences, you can start to understand like, oh, I understand why this is crafted in this way, right? Like, I don't know, some Samidori matchas I find extremely boring. And we were doing some very basic blending experiments. I was like, after tasting so much Samidori during our testing, I was like, oh, wow, I'm starting to understand why people blend. This is like really one dimensional in kind of a boring way. Like, how can I start adding depth to this thing?
Yeah, yeah. And you only come to this judgment because you had the formative experience. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, I think that's a great place to end. So, context to appreciate super important and a surprisingly very complex topic as people move through their consumer journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fun.
And it's fun, right? That's what's important. And we can all have different sets of context to appreciate something. I mean, that's the beauty in this, right? Like, there's just so many different ways you can slice this. And the fact that
Yeah.
it's becoming more and more available and in a democratized way where it's not just reserved for a certain group of people is super exciting. So, it's a very optimistic future from that perspective.
Yeah. We are together. We are actually building a new culture, and within this new culture, we can detect what is of our own preference by ourselves.
Yeah, we can make our own judgments and quality distinctions, which is a great place to be. All right. Well, thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed this, please consider sharing it with a friend, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you in the future.
Thanks.